Jesus began to teach his disciples that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said all this quite openly. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." He called the crowd with his disciples, and he said to them, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will find it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man also will be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father and with the holy angels." This is the gospel of the Lord. Please be seated. You may have caught a little bit of that conversation I was having at the door before we came in, as somebody pointed out to me that there's a gas leak in here and the candles are lit. And so, shall we leave them on? I said, yeah, leave them on. And I realised I'm going to be up there at some stage, so if it's going to ignite, I don't think the first one is going to get it. But there we are. Such is what it's like to be a clergyman, isn't it? Well, when Britain was more of a Christian country than it is today, everybody's conversation used to be sprinkled with biblical references. Whether people knew they were from the Bible or not, they somehow found their way into everyday conversation. So, for example, if we were running my mother ragged and she got really frustrated, she'd say, "Oh, there's no rest for the wicked." And that's straight from Isaiah 57, verse 21. Or when old ideas or old fashions came round again and were presented as new, we turned to one another and we'd say, "Oh, there's nothing new under the sun." And that's from Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 9. Or when a series of public scandals has got a politician or leader into trouble and public opinion was beginning to turn against them, we would say, "The writing is on the wall." And that's from Daniel 5 about King Belshazzar. Or if it was said of a person ignorant of a given subject, getting advice and help from another person who is also ignorant of the subject, we would say, "The blind leading the blind." That's Matthew 15, verse 14. I always remember when John Major's government was in, somebody quipped and said, "It's the bland leading the bland." But the blind leading the blind. Matthew 15, verse 14. I said that when the gas man comes, he's going to come right in the middle of the sermon. And my prophetic words have come to pass. Carry on, you. Just don't mind me. Thank you. Thank you. Well, always nice to have an extra person, isn't it, for the congregation. But the phrase I want to look at this morning is from a passage in Mark's Gospel. And here, Jesus is addressing the people and telling them that if they really want to follow him, then they must be willing to deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow him. And this has found its way into our conversations as words of complaint. So when things are going wrong and there's persistent trouble or illness, then people will shake their heads and they say to each other, "Well, we all have our crosses to bear." Now, this is the wrong use of Jesus' words for several reasons. First of all, because Jesus is actually issuing an invitation here. He's not imposing a test. He's issuing an invitation. He says clearly, if anybody wants to become my follower, then he must take up his cross. There's no compulsion. But when the person says, "Oh, we all have our crosses to bear," then what they're implying is that they've no choice in the situation. That their cross is an uninvited, unsought imposition on them, and it's a rather a pain. But that's not what Jesus is saying here. He's giving an invitation that can be either accepted or rejected. That's the first thing. In the second place, even as he calls people to follow him, Jesus is very careful to lay out the cost of what their decision will cost them. He's very clear about that. I don't know if you see the adverts about joining the armed forces or the Navy or whatever, you know. They are quick always to point, aren't they, to the upside of joining them. Join the Navy, see the world. Or train and have another skill. Don't stay in that dead-end job as butcher. Sorry, Linda. I wrote this for you, you were coming. Don't stay in that dead-end job as a butcher or stacking shelves. But come and join the army. Learn a skill. Get a qualification. But in the process of trying to sell it, they miss out an important thing, and that is you may get caught up in a battle and you may lose your life. But that little detail gets overlooked in the hard sell. But not for Jesus. You see, he's very careful to lay out what it will cost anybody who wants to become a Christian. And let's be honest, we never ever thought about this in the whole process of our baptism, our confirmation. It's never been laid out to us, is it really? That, it's great to become a Christian, but. And that's what Jesus is doing here. You see, he's saying, it will cost you. And he's very honest about this, as are all the great leaders. I remember reading about Garibaldi, the great Italian patriot. And when he appealed for recruits, he said this to them. He says, I offer neither pay, nor quarters, nor provisions. I offer hunger, thirst, forced marches, battles, and death. Let him who loves his country in his heart, and not only with his lips, follow me. Soldiers, all our efforts against superior forces have been unavailing. I have nothing to offer you but hunger and thirst, hardship and death. But I call on all who love their country to join with me. Now that's saying it as it is. There's no soft sell there. He's telling them exactly what they can expect. And many will remember Churchill doing something along the same lines when he says that he promises nothing but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. And so like Garibaldi and like Churchill, Jesus is very much upfront, and he says, if anyone will come after me, if anyone will be a Christian, a follower of mine, then they must deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for me and for the gospel will save it. Pulling no punches here. It's a tough road. But the benefits are out to this world. But what is Jesus talking about here when he talks about all this denying self, taking up the cross, losing life, and all that kind of stuff? Well, in the first place, and in some situations and countries, there's a real risk of physical death. There really is. When Jesus first spoke these words to the disciples, it was a time when it was becoming increasingly more dangerous to be associated with him. In fact, if we read look a bit earlier in our readings, he says that he must go up to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and the scribes and be killed. And if that was going to happen to him, then the odds of his followers suffering the same fate were extremely high. In fact, we forget, don't we, that out of the 12 disciples, that's including Matthias, who replaced Judas, out of the 12, 11 were martyred. And 12 if you include Paul, and the countless others afterwards in the great persecutions. And that's just for starters. You go through the centuries, and Christians are paid with their lives to be associated and follow Jesus, because they set a higher value on following him than they did on the protection of themselves. But even where the Christian's life is not under threat, there's still a cost that you and I have to pay if we are to be truly the followers of Jesus. We are still expected, he says, to deny ourselves and to take up our cross and to lose our lives. We're still expected to do those things, but what does he mean? Well, in 1908, there was a series of famous correspondences in the Times, and the question that was posed and which people were invited to answer was this: What's wrong with the world? And there was a number of famous writers and thinkers and academics, and they all wrote in their answers and what they thought was in response to what was wrong with the world. And this went on for quite some time, but it more or less came to a conclusion when they received one particular response from a famous Christian writer. And he just simply wrote this: "Dear sirs, I am, full stop, yours sincerely, G.K. Chesterton." What's wrong with the world? He says, I am. I am. You are. We are what's wrong with the world. It's people that start wars. It's people that fight for territory. It's people who are selfish and unkind and angry and bitter. It's people that steal and commit adultery. It's people that do all these things. What's wrong with the world? You and I are. We're the problem. It's the sinfulness and the selfishness of all those who inhabit it. Jeremiah was right when he said, the heart, he said, is deceitful above all and desperately corrupt. We'll always want our own way first. No matter how good we are, there's that bit in us always. And so until we're willing to lay down our lives for Jesus, we're never going to get very far down the discipleship road. And Jesus can do very little for us or in us or with us unless we are willing to say, I'm the problem. I'm going to lay down my life in order to follow you. As Jesus puts it in the Sermon on the Mount, he says, no one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you'll be devoted to the one and despise the other. You can't serve yourself and serve Jesus at the same time. Although many people, let's be honest, try to. Yeah, we all want our cake and eat it. You can't, says Jesus. In fact, I would say there's not been one church I've ever served in where there have not been power struggles of one sort or the other, as some people wanted their own way over that of others. And sometimes they quoted the vicar in support of them. But it's power struggles because we are the problem. But, says Jesus, we have to die in order that he may live. And so we must be willing, said Jesus, to lay down our lives, to lay down and to do without our own will and our own way. We don't need to be in charge. We lay down our lives so that he will be in charge. He is the Lord. He is the Master. We want to do his will. That's what we pray in the Lord's Prayer. But do we mean it? Thy will be done. We say that with great gusto, but do we really mean it? This is what Paul says to the Galatians. He says, that's the me that needs to be in control, in charge. I have been crucified with Christ. And it is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life I now live in the flesh, in my body, as in my life, the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. Jesus died for me. The least I can do is to die for him, to set myself aside and say, you are Lord, not me. And so there's that exchange that needs to take place, our life for his, as his life was given for us. We can't have it both ways. We must die in order for him to live. I like what somebody once said, the body has two eyes, but the soul must have just one. But lastly, saying we all have our crosses to bear is wrong because the way it's said suggests that it's a means to no end. In other words, it's suffering just for the sake of it. We all have to suffer, and we all have to bear with it, and that's it, and then we die. But that's not the case with what Jesus is saying here. And you have to look closely, because we forget this. When we hear about the cross and denial and all that, it sends shockwaves to our self-centeredness, doesn't it? All those things. But we forget there's a promise in there, because when he calls us to deny ourselves, take up the cross, it's in order to follow him. And who is he but the one who can give us life in all its fullness? That's what he means when he says, whoever loses his life for me and for the gospel will save it. In the end, you will save your life. You know, it's very challenging to hear Jesus talk about self-denial and taking up the cross and losing your life. And listen to the words, may make you wonder sometimes why anybody would want to be a Christian and a follower of Jesus. The cost is much too high, people say. But you know, as high as the cost may be, it's not as high as the cost of not following him, of not becoming his disciple. Here's how one Christian writer put it. He said, non-discipleship, that's not following Jesus, non-discipleship costs abiding peace. It costs a life penetrated through by love. A faith that sees everything in the light of God's overriding governance for good. It costs hopefulness that stands firm in the most discouraging of circumstances. It costs power to do what is right and withstand the forces of evil. In short, he says, it costs exactly what the abundant life Jesus said he came to bring. You know, the greater cost is saying no to Jesus, not saying yes, because we lose out on so much. You see, not everyone does have their cross to bear, not the way Jesus meant it. That's reserved only for the few who are willing to truly deny themselves and take up their cross in order to follow him. And the question that is posed by this, now, even if we've been Christians for years, or been to church for years, or done all that sort of stuff, the question still is, are you willing to deny yourself, to take up your cross, and to follow him? Are you willing to lose your life for his sake and the gospel so that you may find it, you may save it? Are you willing to do that? I always love those words of that hymn. And I tell you what, the older I get, the more I like the older hymns. We know the hymn, don't we? But here are the two verses I'll quote to you before I end. Take my will and make it thine. It shall be no longer mine. Take my heart, it is thine own. It shall be thy royal throne. Take my love, my Lord, I pour at thy feet its treasure store. Take myself, and I will be ever only all for thee. That last line, ever only Lord for thee. Can you say that? If you can, and you mean it, and you follow it through, then you truly are his disciple. Then the cross is yours. You're called to life for denying yourself. That's dying that you're in charge of life. And you will lose your life. But, here it is, you will find it. You will find it. Because you will have that glorious eternal life that begins now and goes into eternity. And you will be with him, with the Lord, forever. That's a cost worth paying, isn't it? That is a cost worth paying. If anyone come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and come after me. Amen.